It's wonderful to be back at the Rumi Forum. The Rumi Forum is a wonderful institution in town that has hosted so many important programs on religion and peace building. Religion and peace building is a topic of international importance, and that has a pedigree going back decades now of extraordinary people around the world by the thousands who work together at policy levels and also at grassroots levels. Perhaps even 100 years of interfaith peace building since the original Parliament of World Religions in the end of the 19th century. But it has just flowered into a movement of tens of thousands across the world. Some of us do scholarship on this, and some of us do practice, and some of us do policy making. So today we have the great privilege of listening to three wonderful speakers, all from the United States Institute of Peace, which in itself has been a major achievement in Washington of an institutionalized structure of looking at peace building from all different directions. And one of them, due to the first speaker, David Smock, and his own innovations, has become an anchor of thinking within the United States Institute of Peace, and therefore an agenda item for American policy making. So with that, I'll just first introduce David. David is the Vice President of Governance, Law, and a Society, and Director of the Religion and Peacemaking Center at the United States Institute of Peace. And he's worked on African issues for over 30 years, and he will continue to for many years to come. He was also staff member of Ford Foundation, and he served in Ghana, Kenya, Lebanon, Nigeria, New York. And he received a Master's of Divinity degree from the New York Theological Seminary and a doctorate in anthropology from Cornell University. David is also a dear old friend and a mentor in this work. I would not be here if it wasn't for David's encouragement and guidance over the years, so it's a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. It's particularly nice to have you as moderating today, since we have had a long and fruitful relationship and collaboration. Mark is one of the leading lights in this field, and it's a privilege to be here with him. Thought I'd start by just saying a word about the history of the Religion and Peacebuilding program at USIP. Starting in 1991, the Institute initiated a program called Religion, Ethics, and Human Rights. And this program was headed up by Professor David Little, who came from the University of Virginia. And he organized a series of working groups on locations where religion was one of the sources of conflict. And he had working groups on Sudan, on Israel, on Lebanon, on Sri Lanka, on Ukraine. And some of these generated materials that were turned into books by David. The focus was on scholarship and research, and the focus was on religion as a source of conflict. David retired from the Institute in 1999, and we had a little committee at the Institute that tried to decide whether we should continue this focus on religion or not, and if so, what the angle should be. And so I was part of that little committee, and we met and we discussed with various people in the field something of an anomaly for a semi-governmental institution like USIP to have a focus on religion. But the Institute decided that this was very important to continue this focus, but we decided to make two changes. One is that we wouldn't focus so much on scholarship, we'd focus on action in the field. And secondly, we wouldn't focus on religion as a source of conflict so much as we would on religion as a source of peacemaking. And so once we had those guidelines established, I then raised my hand and said I would like to direct the program, and that was accepted. So we started in 2000, and we've been active in many parts of the world since then. And I thought, before I turned to Susan and to Palwasha to talk about their activities, to give you concrete examples of what we've been engaged in, I'd set out some of the basic principles and strategies that have guided our work. First of all, is not to exaggerate the role of religion in conflict. So many places in the world, so many press reports talk about Christians and Muslims being in conflict with each other, and Sunnis and Shias. And it's true that religion is a factor in conflict. But to give an example of Nigeria, where I've done a lot of work, we were very involved in Plateau State in Nigeria. And the description of the conflict there before we entered was that Christians and Muslims are killing each other. In this particular location, 1,000 people have been killed, mostly Christians killing Muslims. But when we dug into the situation, we found that religion was only a handle, was only a convenient way to describe the two groups that were in conflict. They differed in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language, in terms of occupation, in terms of socioeconomic class, and critically important, some were settlers who had lived there forever, and the others were migrants who had moved down from the north. So what was described as a conflict between two religious groups just happened that these two groups were divided by religion, but they weren't arguing over theology. It was struggles for economic advancement and political power. Second principle is that we choose to work in places where religion is one factor in conflict. In addition, we work in places where we can see religious actors as important potential peacemakers, like in Colombia, where religion is not a factor in the conflict between the FARC and the government, but Christian groups of various stripes are critical players in promoting peace there. Third, we work with local partners. We recognize our own shortcomings, even though we have considerable field experience. We know that we have to have local partners in order to help us identify who the players are on the ground, who we should be working with, what strategies are most appropriate, understand the nature of the conflicts so that we can have an effective interaction. In Nigeria, for instance, we have 3 different local partners that we've worked with on different projects over the years. Fifth, we work to promote interfaith relations and intra-faith relations. Interfaith relations meaning between Christians and Muslims, or between Jews and Muslims and Christians, and intra-faith relations, Sunni, Shia, or Catholic and Protestant. And examples of those are Iraq, where we have been working, Sri Lanka, where we have been working, and Burma. And we work to enhance the peacemaking skills of local religious actors. And we've done that in Iraq, we've done that in Sri Lanka, where we've done a considerable work with local partners to do a considerable amount of training of religious leaders to work in interfaith settings and to understand each other and be effective peacemakers. Then we have worked to, and this is a particular interest of Susan's, that we work to enhance the role of women as religious peacemakers. And we've done that particularly in Colombia. And we have a book coming out that Susan is one of the co-editors that will elucidate on this particular aspect of our work and of our interests. And finally, we look at religion as one component, one dimension of combating violent extremism. We've done that in working on curriculum materials from madrasas, and Palwasha will mention some of that work. We've worked to try to understand and counter the extremism and violence of Boko Haram in Nigeria. So with that, I'll turn to Susan, who will give some more concrete examples.
Let me just introduce you with a little bit of bio. Susan Hayward develops conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation projects targeting the religious sector. She joined the Institute in 2007, and she's focused on Colombia, Iraq, Burma, and Sri Lanka. She also coordinates an initiative on the intersection of women, religion, conflict, and peace building with Berkeley Center. She got a master's degree in gender, politics, and religion from Harvard's Divinity School, and a BA in religion and global studies, and a BA in comparative religions from Tufts, and a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School. And she is also a good friend. So.
And unfortunately, you had left Fletcher right before I started there,
Exactly,
which was
exactly, I know.
a big gap at Fletcher. Because like a lot of international relations schools at the time, and I think still, doesn't have a very strong analysis of religion. And so I missed having you there, but I'm glad to have you as a colleague here in DC. So as David said, I'm going to speak a little bit about, give you a little bit more of a granular understanding of the kinds of projects we do on the ground by speaking some to what I've done. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of background too on how I landed in this field and at USIP. So as Mark mentioned, I've been there since 2007. And I had actually been here for a little bit of a stint in DC in 2003, working some with the UN Refugee Council. And I had been focusing on refugee work and policy and on-the-ground work in Minneapolis, working with political asylees. And while I had studied religion academically, was interested in intellectually in my bachelor's degree, my human rights work, my refugee work, and my religion interest had sort of followed parallel tracks, but not really been overlapping. But it was working with, particularly with the political asylees in Minneapolis, and hearing their stories. So my job was to do the intake interviews and to hear from their story if they met the legal criteria for getting political asylum in the US. So I was hearing these stories of people from Liberia, from Somalia, from Tibet, from Burma, from all over the world, who had faced political torture, who had been indiscriminately incarcerated, who had had to flee from their homes with not much with them. And listening to their stories, the religion just kept coming up. It was the reason that they were targeted. It was who gave them safe sanctuary in their home countries. It was almost 100% of the time when they got to the US, who was helping them with humanitarian relief, with finding pro bono legal aid, and so on. A lot of these were religious institutions or religious factors. And then the way in which they spoke about their experiences, and they spoke about how they found resilience, how they were moving forward, how they found hope. A lot of that was also grounded in faith. And so I became very interested in this, this complex relationship between religion and justice and politics and survival in the midst of violence and suffering, and trying to determine what to do and trying to find out where the places of sanctuary and the places of assistance are. And I also became interested in moving away from refugee work because as much as I loved working on refugee policy, I wanted to get to the heart of actually trying to eradicate violence. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done there, especially in the world right now. But I wanted to move towards peace building to try to eradicate the violence that leads to so much refugee flow around the world. So I was in DC, and I started going to some of the events of the religion program, and some of the things that struck me about this was at the time of the run-up to the invasion in Iraq, and so there were some robust discussions happening around just war theory and the decision to go into Iraq that I found very striking. But I also appreciated that the program existed before 9/11. So it wasn't purely looking at religion in terms of Islamic terrorism. It wasn't just looking at Islam as a source of violence and terrorism, but was also looking at forms of Christian extremism in Nigeria, focusing on Jewish nationalism, Hindu nationalism, the ways in which religions of all traditions have sometimes been used to justify exclusionary policies and violence, and that the religions of all traditions, in an equal opportunity way, provide resources for peace building. So I appreciated that sort of pre-9/11 approach to the question. So I went to David and I said, if I wanted to work in this field, what would I need to do? And he said, go get a degree in international relations, go get a degree in religion, go get some experience on the ground, and then come back to me, which is what I did, which is how I ended up in 2007 at USIP. And I had focused on Asia and Sri Lanka in part because my background in graduate school, or in university, had been in Asia and on Buddhism in particular. But I also picked Sri Lanka because it went against that popular assumption about how religion, violence, and peace building interact. So the popular assumption out there is that the Abrahamic traditions, that the monotheistic traditions, tend to be more prone to political manipulation or to violence or to extremism, and then the dharmic faiths, Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and Shintoism and so on, are more prone to peace and understanding. But if you've spent much time in Asia, you know that it's much more complicated than that Buddhism has been used in Japan during World War II with Zen Buddhism, or in Sri Lanka and other places. And now currently what we're seeing in Sri Lanka and Burma, that Buddhism, Hinduism with the Hindu nationalist movements in India and so on, that all religions have this capacity to be used, no matter how beautiful their core teachings are, have these capacities to be used to legitimate violence, or to legitimate violence in the name of some act of justice in the eye of the beholder. So Sri Lanka was a great counterexample that forced one to think in a little bit more of a complicated way, because you have the majority community there, Buddhist, the Buddhist monks there, over the course of the 26-year civil war, mobilizing in opposition to peace processes, drawing on Buddhist teachings in order to pursue opposition to minority rights. And then you have the primary minority community is the Tamil, who are Hindu and Christian, but the third ethnic community there is the Muslim community, who are ethnically cleansed from the north by the Tamil Tigers, who were shot at by the government. But over the course of the 26 years of war, they never took to arms in order to defend themselves. So when you asked them about that, they would say, because Islam teaches us not to do that. And so it automatically forced a more complex analysis. So that's all to give you background. Now let me talk a little bit more about some of the work we're doing, and I'll start with Sri Lanka, having given you that background. So when I started in 2007, I'd already had some background in Sri Lanka, and so David encouraged me to go back there and see how we might be helpful. And so I went and I started working with an organization there that had in the past done some work within the Buddhist community. It was an organization led by two Sinhala Buddhist peacemakers, and one of them in particular was a professor of conflict resolution and Buddhist philosophy, so he had a lot of cachet within the Buddhist monastic community there. And I worked with them on developing a project that would move from working exclusively with the Buddhist monastic community to expanding that out to include clergy from the other three religious traditions there, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam. But what we did is that we had seen in Sri Lanka that there had been, over the years, a lot of attempts to jump to interreligious work that then sort of fell apart or didn't get very far. And it was in part because, my assessment anyway, was in part because there hadn't been, there were a lot of conflicts within each of the religious communities. There was a lot of debate, for example, within the Buddhist community about how to respond to the ethnic conflict, about how to address the concerns of the Buddhist community in terms of archaeological sites around the island, in terms of issues of governance and so on, in terms of issues of proselytization by the Christian community. There was a lot of debates within that community about what to do. And so when you would jump to the interreligious community, they hadn't necessarily worked those things out amongst themselves. And this is true across all of the traditions. A lot of tensions within the Christian community, between the more recent phenomenon of Pentecostal Christians and between the mainline and the Catholic traditions that have been there for a long time. A lot of tensions within the Muslim community, between those who had been there for a long time and those who had served. A lot of Sri Lankan Muslims and others will go and serve in Arab states for a while in employee services there, and then will come back with different practices of Islam. So that was creating a lot of tensions within the Muslim community there. And so we spent, with this network, we spent a year and a half just on the mono-religious track with these groups of about 30, 40 religious actors from around the island, people who are not at the top of their institutions, but who are middle-level religious leaders who had influence in their local communities, but were not at the top such that they were institutionally constrained and didn't have the time and didn't have the connections to the local community in order to affect change. And then after they had, amongst themselves, come to some common vision of what they wanted and developed an idea of what it means to talk about peace building within a Buddhist frame or within a Muslim frame or within a Hindu frame, then we began to bring them together. But when we brought them together, it was not about just talk, because we know that that issues that drive violent conflict are about structural injustices. They are about ways in which the state is functioning or various social, economic, political institutions are operating that are excluding people, that are unjust, that are keeping people's needs from, basic human needs from being met. And you're not going to solve those things just through talk. And so we stressed from the beginning that what the point was of bringing these folks together was to move beyond dialogue. Was dialogue in order to understand the perspectives and the experiences of suffering that all communities had faced, but then to find ways that these actors could address some of these issues driving the core conflict together. Also not recognizing that religious actors can fix everything, but that that if they would map out all of the various drivers of conflict, and they would say, what are the particular issues that we as religious actors in our community, recognizing the connection we have to policymakers, recognizing the influence we have over public opinion, recognizing what we can bring to address issues of poverty and health or whatever it is, what are we positioned to address, and then how can we do it in an interfaith basis? And so that's how that project continued to unfold and has still unfolded. So now there's 6 centers around the island where some of this work operates out of. There's about 400 religious actors who are part of it. There's now a parallel network being set up that is exclusively female religious actors, so Buddhist nuns, Catholic nuns, and so on, whereas the first one was almost exclusively male religious leaders. We also worked in Iraq, as David mentioned, and in what I would say about the Iraq work, which is not ongoing anymore, but where a lot of our work is focused on the civil society sector that is religion and working with religious actors. In Iraq, we have actually done work with policymakers as well, which is key, because you're not going to have religious pluralism, you're not going to have religious freedom, you're not going to have religious institutions and actors playing a positive role in justice and peacemaking if you don't have an enabling policy environment for that, and a state system that gives space to religious actors to be able to play this role and that addresses some of these structural issues that feed some interreligious tensions in terms of excluding some groups and inclusion of other groups. And so there we worked with the Council of Representatives Religious Affairs Committee in Baghdad. We worked with the Ministry of Religion in the KRG, and we worked with some of the Sunni and Shia and Christian and other minority endowments doing support for policy development and for training programs. But we also worked there with civil society actors who, in Iraq, as in some other places, you have sharp divides between the secular activists and organizations, or those who would identify themselves with the secular world, and then those who identify with the religious world. And there's a huge gulf between them, a lot of bias that goes both ways, and that makes it difficult for them to work together. And in any of these places where we're working, everybody has to work together because the problems affect everybody. And the only solutions that are going to be sustainable are those in which people across different identity groups, across different sectors, and across the secular religious divide are working together to address them. And so we worked with a group of civil society actors who are already very well versed in human rights and peace building in order to develop their comfort level with working with the religious sector. Because for a lot of them, they were afraid, rightly so, to engage with the religious sector in Iraq. They were worried about it opening up a can of worms. I need to shut down on it. Opening up a can of worms and unleashing some dynamics that they couldn't control. They were worried about their own personal security. So we worked with them over the course of several years in order to, with small projects, and then building on that over the course of several years to do more robust projects, working in Sharia colleges, working with religious educators, working with religious actors in areas that were experiencing particular interreligious divides. So I'll stop there.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Let me just introduce Palwasha Kakar. Is a Senior Program Officer for Religion and Peacemaking at USIP. She joined USIP after 4 years at the Asia Foundation and was the Afghanistan Director of Women's Empowerment and Development. and led Gender Mainstreaming and Civil Society Unit, UNDP, also for Afghanistan. It's a pleasure to work with you. Some of my most exciting and scary work was in Afghanistan with Muslim imams, and I really am looking forward to hearing your wisdom on this.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you, and I've heard so much about you. And I think it would be helpful perhaps if I give some context to the work that I started at U.S. Institute of Peace, just a little bit of background. In 1989, when the Soviets were pulling out of Afghanistan, I was 13 years old. I'm an Afghan American, and my family decided to move from Seattle to Afghanistan at that point. But unfortunately, because of the civil war unfolding in Afghanistan, we went as far as Pakistan, as far as the border town. And there I met my extended family on my father's side that I hadn't met. And there were two things that I noticed at that point. One was that I was the only girl among my cousins that was going to school. And second was this idealization of war, of jihad, and of martyrdom. And both of these led to extensive discussions that I had with my cousins and with my uncles about, first of all, allowing my female cousins to go to school, and second of all, understanding how this conflict was playing out, because I had a different understanding of jihad and a different understanding of Islamic faith and the struggle. So through these conversations, I quickly noticed that the only way to make any headway was to discuss through an Islamic framework, particularly related to women's rights, as well as a peace framework in terms of forgiveness, in terms of the importance of consultation, of conflict resolution. And so it was through these conversations that I also found my passion for advocating for women's rights and the protection of women's rights within an Islamic framework, as well as looking at the importance of describing and explaining the whole peaceful framework within Islam. And this led me to do some work very early on, in early stages, while my father was working in an Afghan refugee university to help with building the curriculum on peace and conflict resolution that they were trying to mandate for all students coming out of refugee camps, so that they had this mandatory course. The idea was that these were going to be the future leaders of Afghanistan, and they should have conflict resolution skills. The first class, it was very interesting to see, had a lot of people walking out, because there was this very different narrative being taught in the classes, where martyrdom was not the high ideal, but a peaceful resolution was the high ideal, and understanding the whole struggle internally to come to a peaceful outcome. So that was very interesting in my early exposure to this, and that really brought about my passion for working more with conflict resolution, peace building, and also on women's rights, both within an Islamic framework. So after I graduated and finished my master's, I decided to go to Afghanistan and work particularly on peace building and women's rights and governance issues within an Islamic framework. And that led me to work with USIP. And it's very interesting because, considering that some of my early work, some of the early stages of my own passion came from working with curriculum and the importance of curriculum, the United States Institute of Peace has been working exactly on this issue, as David had mentioned, in Nigeria, but it started with working in Indonesia, in Aceh, developing curriculum with local partner in 2004 on a peace education in an Islamic framework, working with madrasas there. And that led to, in the Philippines, in Mindanao, the request for a feasibility study and work to develop curriculum as well. And there was a crossover in terms of people who had been working on the curriculum in Indonesia, went to the Philippines, and then helped them in the Philippines develop their curriculum for the madrasas there. In Pakistan, similarly, we've been working for a long time on developing textbooks with the madrasas, and it's been a very long process to get the governing board of the madrasas, which is often called by the ITMP or the WAFAQs, to get them on board and to get their their stamp of approval on this peace curriculum, and then it's been used to train madrasa teachers in Pakistan. A second curriculum book has come out as well, and we're working towards having that being trained in Pakistan. Also, this curriculum was used by the Ministry of Education to work with schools, as well as 16 Sufi, different Sufi leaders worked to take it forward, particularly in using it to combat extremism and radicalization in Pakistan. And so fourthly, we've currently started working in Nigeria on developing curriculum and curriculum guides for madrasas there as well. Another big program that's on my portfolio is working in Libya on understanding exactly what David was mentioning. Where are the places that religious leaders are working for peace and justice, using religious discourse, working with religious discourse for peace and justice. And so currently we're working on research on the ground. We have 14 local researchers that have been, that are from the 4 different regions in Libya who have been doing interviews, and we're working through that research. And it's been very interesting to hear the different findings in terms of how the overlap of tribal leadership and religious discourse has been very effective in this way, as well as the importance of Sufi leaders in Libya. And finally, one program that overlaps between both the peace building and the women's rights is working on the protection of women's rights and women's rights issues in countries that have constitutions that have some sort of Islamic clause related to laws not going against the tenets of Islam. And this is something I'd worked on previously as well in Afghanistan. And so right now the idea is to do this comparative work both in Egypt, Libya, and Afghanistan. In Libya, we're working closely with 3 different pillars. And the whole approach is, the idea of having these 3 different pillars is the successful approach to making change happen in order to, within this Islamic framework, in order to protect rights. And the 3 pillars are women's rights advocates, or political advocates in general, religious leaders, and legal advocates. And so to bring those 3 together to work on checks and balances, for example, in Libya, as they're right now in the process of doing constitution making, drafting, to have them talk together about how to best put in the checks and balances. And the importance is seen in Afghanistan right now, where there is in the Constitution a clause that particularly says that no laws can go against the tenets of Islam, and that's been used in Parliament to strike down, for example, the Elimination of Violence Against Women law that was brought up last year in Parliament. And a lot of religious leaders in Parliament and elsewhere have just been issuing fatwas left and right saying such and such law goes against the tenets of Islam, and there is no real structure or system to deal with the implementation of that part of the Constitution. So in Libya, the idea is to figure out whether there's something that can be put in the Constitution to have them collaborate, the 3 pillars collaborate on this. In Afghanistan, the idea is to have the 3 pillars collaborate on developing some sort of a mechanism to ensure checks and balances. And in Egypt, it's more of a reflexive study in terms of what's happened so far with the different iterations of the Constitution and how far they've come currently with the 2013 Constitution and additional clauses in that Constitution. So it's a very interesting overlap between working both within a religious framework on women's rights issues as well as peace issues, because this has often instigated a lot of conflict in these countries. So that's where I'm going to end and open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Could I just add one footnote to Palwasha's presentation, just to indicate how precarious some of these activities are? One of the 14 researchers in Libya was killed this week.
Yeah, and these are wonderful comments, and there's so many things to talk about. We'll open it up to the audience. It's always an interesting question when we're focusing on one religion or another, is to make the parallels. So what would happen in the United States if there was a constitutional amendment that nothing in American law can go against Christianity? Or, you know, what would happen here? You know, in terms of the 1,000 Christianities and 1,000 interpretations, what would happen if there's a law like that in Israel? Nothing can go against Judaism. I can think of 1,000 laws that would lead to immediate mass violence. So, you know, there are, you know, so this is a real challenge, but a very creative process that is ongoing in terms of how you work with systems, and what you said also about working with systems. So it's really, this is a wonderful overview of the kind of very serious work that's going on, and the efforts that people are making. So with that, let's open it up, and I'd like to take a few questions at a time, because it enriches, first of all, you all get to express yourselves more, and it enriches the conversation. But limit your questions to about a minute or more. So I see Peter, and then go ahead, Peter.
Peter Kovac. A general question. You've talked a lot about what the new evaluation culture we call outputs, but I'd like to hear more about outcomes, some of the more dramatic successes you've had. And then two quick factual questions. For Susan, what is the name of the Buddhist group in Sri Lanka you referred to that you're working with? And in terms of the Pakistani madrasas, my understanding is that there are 5 separate confederations, including the Sufis or Brahmins, and then there may be a council of all of them. Who is it you're working with? Thank you.
Great. Those are all great questions. So you'll be making notes of the questions, right? So that we can have more voices, right? I'm making notes too. I'm not talking to people on my cell phone. I'm actually taking notes. So I have this. Go ahead.
So my name is Andra, and I work with Interfaith Bridge Building, and this is a question, really an informational question that would be helping with the organizations that I work with. There is an upcoming summit of rabbis and imams to work with the relationship between the Jewish community and the Muslim community, and also I'm curious about where we can get information to be able to help inform our planning of that. And then secondly, in terms of intrafaith relations, where can we access information to help build better relationships between the Sunnis and the Shias right here?
No, let me take one more question. Go ahead.
I'm Taliba Hassan, Darul Noor Islamic Center in Virginia. It's directed to, yes, the peace curriculum. I'd like to know, it's geared to what grades? K to high school, or you start high school? And can you give us an example of what would be a topic that y'all would be teaching in the peace curriculum?
Okay, so we'll start with those. Why don't we reverse the order? Palwasha, why don't you begin? If that's okay.
Sure. So the 5 Wafaaqs, my understanding is that there is a governing board, and at the ITMP, which is the Ittihad, the Talimat, Madrasa Pakistan, something like that, that is the governing board that they work with. It's independent, but has a relationship to the government to ensure certification, so that when people come out of the madrasas, their certifications are then recognized by the government. And it's the ITMP that was worked with, as well as the Ministry of Education. So yes, they're the Wafaaqs that are under the ITMP. The ITMP was the one that gave the stamp of approval. The peace curriculum it's a teacher's guide for the madrasa teachers, and so it's geared towards the teachers. In terms of the topics, I can get back with you in terms of like the table of contents, or like some more specific topics to explain some of the stuff it's very interesting in terms of some of the stuff that they go down into. But it's generally in terms of peacemaking and what the individual can do, and how to understand, some consensus building, conflict resolution, those sort of things. And verses from the Quran are there, as well as Hadith, that talk about some of those specific issues.
Yeah, and it breaks down both in terms of conflict analysis, various forms of conflict resolution, and third-party intervention, and then it also has an entire section that's looking at issues of justice. So includes things like human rights and women's rights and that kind of thing. And as Palwasha said, it was written by Sunni and Shia scholars. The one in Pakistan was written by Sunni and Shia scholars who came together and brought in resources from both traditions, and then combined it with some of the conflict resolution theory and practices that are already kind of out there in the world that are more Western driven. So to try to create more of an indigenous frame that would be resonant in Pakistan and elsewhere. In terms of examples of outcomes, one I can speak to is in Burma that's more recent. And that is, we have been working with a number of the more indigenous interfaith networks that arose in the aftermath of the military regime starting to move over to a civilian government, whereas before that, inter-ethnic and interreligious work was really outlawed. It couldn't be done. And so as the space became more available, various forms of interreligious groups started arising, and that was really sparked in large part by Cyclone Nargis as well, where when the government didn't respond to provide humanitarian relief, a lot of the Buddhist and the Christian community came together in order to respond to an immediate need, and that sort of sparked this larger effort at building interreligious relationships in a society where it hadn't been encouraged, and there was kind of a big gulf and a lot of misunderstanding. So a lot of these religious actors with whom we've been working with whom we've given some capacity building in terms of conflict analysis and conflict response, have, in the midst of the past couple of years when there's been this scourge of interreligious violence that's been breaking out, particularly directed against the Muslim community by Buddhist groups, and there's been a rise of some Buddhist extremist groups that are monk-led, that have fostered some of the rhetoric that has then justified some of these violent attacks. These religious actors have been monitoring when there's rumors, because a lot of the violence breaks out as a result of rumors that the Muslim community in this village is stockpiling weapons, or the Buddhist community is stockpiling weapons. So when they hear these rumors are happening, they will immediately go into action, get in a van, the imam, the monk, some lawyers and some other civil society activists who are part of it, and they will go to that village where these rumors are supposedly originating from, and they will investigate to find out what's going on, working with the local religious actors there. They will liaise with the police in order to get the police involved in ways to maintain local security. And so they have a number of examples of places where things were ratcheting up, things were getting really tense, where it felt like violence could break out, and they were able to de-escalate the situation through some of their work. And they've helped to then foster some of these, what they're calling conflict prevention committees around the country. And we've been working both with them and then with the police as well to try to ensure that they're working together to try to mitigate this rise in communal violence, particularly looking into the next year where there's going to be presidential election, where there's going to be the results of the census, and there's some other potential flashpoints. So that's one example of an outcome. The organization I work for, Peter, which is not a specifically Buddhist organization, it's just the heads of the organization are Buddhist, but they don't identify as a faith-based organization, but it's called the Center for Peacebuilding and Reconciliation. I'll leave it at that.
I'll pick up on the success stories. One of our most dramatic successes was in Nigeria, working with Interfaith Mediation Center, which is our principal partner there. I read on the internet that the community in Plateau State, where 1,000 people had been killed, Christians, and mostly Christians killing Muslims. And I went back to the Interfaith Mediation Center, the pastor and imam, and said, well, why don't you offer your services as mediators? So they approached the governor, and he approved it. They went in and did background research on the sources of the conflict. We then went together it was an elaborate process of mediation between the two communities. Ended up the Christians apologizing to the Muslims, and the Muslims apologizing to the Christians, and seeking forgiveness and reconciliation, and a peace agreement was struck. This was 10 years ago. Well, there's been conflict and fighting throughout Plateau State and surrounding areas. This particular community has been quiet and peaceful, and while 60% of the villagers had fled that community from the earlier fighting, now almost all those people have returned to the community to live in peace with each other. And we did a DVD called The Pastor and Imam, which describes some of this material, which we can share with you if you're interested. In terms of the rabbis and imams, I'm not quite sure which particular rabbis and imams conference you're talking about, but we've been involved with one international program that has brought together rabbis and imams, and I provided them with some materials which I can share with you as well. If you give me your email address, I can send it to you. It came originally out of a working group between Jews and mainline Christians in this country that were trying to overcome mutual suspicion and hostility, and I did a working group process for them that then I translated into what could be used for the imams and rabbis working group. But as I say, I can share that.
Maybe I'll just add to that and say that it's a good question that should remain open about a better source of how we all know everything that's going on globally at the cutting edge. So between rabbis and imams, between Sunni and Shia. I've been writing a lot lately about Sunni-Shia relations as a core future issue, but I don't know where to find the information on what's happening. And certainly a lot of it might not be in English. So I'll keep it as an open question that we should think about. My first instincts these days are actually to Twitter that, to actually search on Twitter. When I want to know the cutting edge of what's happening in Syria right now, in the last hour, I Twitter Syria. So there's a lot that comes up. If you put in maybe Sunni-Shia relations, you might see some people doing cutting edge work. But we should think about that as a community of scholarship on peace building, about where the cutting edge of that is. So let's take I have some questions, but let's take is there anybody else who would like to add? I'm going to add. Yes, please.
Just read recently about Christians leaving Iraq, and it was very kind of devastating. They're leaving and they're not coming back, and it was it's not what I had heard otherwise. Our church has had a relationship with the church over there, so I wanted to know what you knew, Susan, about the situation of Christians in Iraq.
It's pretty bad. The Christian community has been decimated since the invasion, since 2003. And even before the rise of ISIS, the Christian community had gone down to at least half of what it was previously. But I think with the rise of ISIS, it's gone to an even smaller amount than it was before. And it's not just the Christian community, it's also the Yazidi and the Sabian Mandian, which are two other religious minority groups there as well. And of course, Sunni and Shia are also being affected by the rise of ISIS. But yeah, I mean, what you've heard is true. The Christian, as well as some of the other religious minority communities, have really not felt that they were safe in Iraq, and so a lot of them have fled.
There's no interfaith kind of group working together. I mean, the Christians.
There are pockets.
Working with imams, or
there are pockets of it, but nothing robust in Iraq, and nothing that has been able to provide them with the sense of security that they need in order to stay there. And it's sad. It's sad for the Christian community, for the Yazidi, and for the Sabian, all of whom have these deep ties to the country, to Mesopotamia. I mean, prior to the modern state of Iraq, and this is sort of the home place of a lot of all three of those traditions, and they're finding that they don't feel the security in order to stay in their home countries, in their home places.
On another tack, what has been the place of social media that you have used to institute with peace building? It seems to me like that. So,
we have not been that effective with our social media. We have a whole program at the Institute on social media, but it hasn't connected effectively with our activities in the religion sphere.
Except Burma.
Except Burma, okay, go ahead.
In Burma, a lot of the extremist rhetoric or the anti-Muslim rhetoric has been, and these rumors have been spread through social media. And so we've been working very closely with our media team there, bringing together religious actors those involved in the media sector, and technologists. And so we're going to have a big event in December where it's going to be looking at the role of social media, hate speech, and how peace builders, religious actors concerned about rising religious extremism, and technologists can be working together to either counter some of this hate speech within the social media and to try to monitor and respond to it, or more likely in a Burmese cultural context where it's not necessarily about countering extremist rhetoric, how to foster more what they call love speech through social media.
That needs to be done in this country. I mean, I can't even yell on hate speech about Muslims right now. It's just horrendous.
Yeah.
There'll be
And
more.
There'll
be a lot more.
And I don't know, it seems like we here ought to start a positive love speech rhetoric. If anybody was thinking we should just be spreading good stuff somehow, just do it.
Let's have 2 more people who want to speak. Go ahead. First.
Hi, I'm Michael Berninger, International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And my question is, does USIP anticipate a role for itself in countering violent extremism, looking at it from a domestic standpoint? We've talked about refugees, and maybe just looking at diaspora overall. The evidence points that a lot of radicalization is happening in a homegrown capacity, whether in Europe or whether in the U.S. And does USIP see a role for itself in engaging domestic actors who are involved in countering violent extremism or preventing radicalization from happening?
And then this gentleman. Yes, sir.
Paul Wee is my name. I think I have a sense of what the answer might be, but I'm not really quite sure. The USIP is not an NGO in the normal sense of the word. Maybe you could define precisely the difference, and what are the pros and cons of being associated so closely with the U.S. government?
Paul used to be a staff member of the Institute's religion program, so we should ask you for an answer to that question. I mean, we call ourselves an independent federal agency. We're created by Congress. All of our money comes from U.S. government sources. We are not staff members of the U.S. government. Our paychecks don't come from the U.S. Treasury. We try to play at both sides of the street, where it seems advantageous to consider ourselves a governmental organization. We kind of lean on that side of the street, and when it, in sensitive places where association with the U.S. government is a negative rather than a positive, we tend to lean the other way, while not denying what our complicated structure and independence is. But we found that we can be a bridge builder between official U.S. government sources and personnel and the independent NGO activist sector, both in this country and internationally. And we're still working out what our true nature is.
I also want to add a question or add a...
Let me answer this one over here.
Oh, yes, please, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We are constrained from doing anything domestically. It has to be international. So while we can address those issues internationally, we can't do anything domestically.
I also want to raise something with, I think the audience can see that there's a strain of intense pragmatism to the way in which you approach the question of outcomes and how things can result. And it sounds to me like ever since that mandate at the end of the Religion and Human Rights period was that it would be moving towards the question of peace building. My question at this point, and you raised this about Nigeria and you raised the importance of policymakers, is that increasingly we're discovering that as much as many of the foot soldiers of violence in history have been religious and religiously motivated, whether it be the Crusades or many other moments, or Protestant Catholic wars perpetually, that when you really look at the history of it, it was petty dictators and kings that were utilizing and turning on the religion switch whenever they needed it for their political gain, their financial gain, or military gain. So my assessment after years and years of working in the field is that that's exactly what's happening today. And that geopolitical actors are using this, that we as pawns end up addressing religion, and even our military addresses religion, but the actual actors are not that. So the question for policymakers, or the question I ask you, is how can our work move more towards exposing the secular or geopolitical aspects of when the religion button is turned on, and how can we turn it off in terms of violence? And how can our work be effective in doing that? I like the fact that you're moving people towards practical policy questions of what together do we need to do about poverty, or about the environment, or about the tsunami. That's very, very powerful. But I'm also asking on the policy level of how can we move the global community towards shutting that button off that we have all used since the end of the Cold War. Actually, since the middle of the Cold War, that has been used for very secular purposes. Yeah. Okay. So why don't we have a round, and then we'll end with that. So why don't we start with you?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I really, for me, it's something that's often a struggle. As we're looking at the work on the ground in Libya, we're seeing this happening. With the research, we're seeing all kinds of leaders using this religious discourse in such a negative way. At the same time, it seems that people are recognizing it, and there is this reaction against it. And so I think some of what we're seeing in the region in North Africa is a lot of this reaction against this religious rhetoric. But then where does that leave them standing? And so, it's still this precarious balance. Yes, they say we are religious, we believe in religion, but then this whole rhetoric. And so how do you, the question you're asking about how do we expose this as to what it is very key. I think on the one hand, it's important to have messaging and to have various kinds of messaging, and we've seen religious leaders stand up against radicalization and say this isn't the correct message that is being given. But on the other hand, we're also seeing this anti-religion, sort of anti-religion or anti-Islamist movement also happening at the same time. And yet there is such a stronghold. We still see the strong Ansar Sharia in Libya doing all kinds of acts. So we still see the Grand Mufti, speaking about violence within a religious framework. So I think it's a very difficult question to get at. On the one hand, you want to use messaging. On the other hand, you don't want to uphold one group or one religious sect over another. And on the other hand, you also don't want to have people labeled, or people themselves don't want to be labeled as irreligious or somehow separate from religion.
Exactly.
They see themselves within it. So it's a very difficult. I don't have any clear answer for it, except
that is a good answer.
It's a problem.
Because the beginning of good answers is acknowledging the complexity of, but naming it as something we need to think about and work. Yeah.
Throughout history, we've had people drawing on not just religion, but on various forms of ideology in order to support violence. And I don't think that's ever going to change. Whether it's a religious ideology, whether it's ethnic nationalism, whether it's the name of Marxism or the name of democracy, or whatever it is that is being used as a sort of totalizing narrative or totalizing vision of the good is going to be used to legitimate violence, or is particularly in the midst of, in a more micro level, in the midst of campaigning and in the midst of sort of the democratic process and so on. These appeals are what work, and so I don't think that's going to change. And so for me, the answer lies in, yes, holding policymakers to account when they do that, but it more so lies in building the community resilience to be able to withstand that, to be able to see it for what it is. And that's what a lot of our conversations in Burma right now have been, particularly leading up to, again, the upcoming presidential campaign and so on in the next couple of years, is recognizing how the religion card is being played right now in ways that are dividing communities against each other, and ways that are ultimately harming the local community and benefiting particular political parties or particular spoilers of the reform process or whatever it is. So helping them gain the analysis and the perspective to be able to see that, to then be able to develop the connections between different groups or just sort of, you know, taking the red pill in the matrix and being able to see how that's being played in order to withstand it, I think has been how we've approached it.
I don't have anything to add on this topic to what my colleagues have said, but I just want to thank you all for coming, and if there are things we can do in follow-up, we'd be happy to be responsive. So thank you.
One thing that our community is experimenting with, and this is really interesting to me, in the nexus of action and policy, is that we're, like for example, just a few days ago, the foreign minister of Iran and the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia met on the sidelines of the United Nations. And it was historic, and it's being portrayed as a historic turning point by all sides. And I take full credit, because 2 weeks before, I wrote an op-ed on the fact that Iran and Saudi have to talk. And the strategy was, the secular strategy has been to shame. Islam is the problem. Islam has destroyed the Middle East. And this is coming from Arabs, often from Arab Christians and others, saying the decline of civilization in the Middle East is due to, you know, the tyranny of Islam, etc. And that doesn't go anywhere, because in the end it pushes people back into their own camps. But one other way is to expose the geopolitical. Instead of shaming, you just say, you know, Iran and Saudi have to talk. Let's stop with making this a Sunni-Shia war. We need the nations to talk. So that is not a shame, but it is a redirect. And I think a lot of us have to redirect. Please don't use Judaism for your security concerns in Israel. You know, say it, name it. Because in some ways what we're happening is that religion is being held captive until we name the separation of religious concerns and religious needs, which sometimes are unacceptable. There are some religious things that are too extreme. But don't use it, please. Or name it. And that way I think we need to all think about how to, and this is what you began with, David, in Nigeria, of how we get into the thick of the forest and then say, excuse me, this isn't religion. You folks have to deal with X, Y, and Z. Okay. So thank you very much for coming.